So here we are at the first of our review points for Unit 2. And you can see from the diagram here that the marketing analysis that we need to do and the marketing information that we need to capture is around the organisation itself, the industry in which it fits, and the macro environment in which the industry sits. So we need to understand things about the organisation, because it's from understanding things about the organisation that we derive strengths and weaknesses, which we're going to use in our thinking about what strategies might be available and what options might be available to the organisation. We then need to look at the customers, the competitors and the collaborators who make up the industry in which the organisation competes. And then we need to understand that the industry, every industry, is affected by its macro environment, be that a nation, state, a city, or a region, where the conditions that are in the macro environment affect the industry and all participants in the industry equally, and quite often all industries equally. So we need to understand these things because these are the sources of opportunities and threats, which comes from the context, the customers, the competitors and the collaborators, and because the strengths and weaknesses that allow us to seize those opportunities or avoid the threats are understood by virtue of analysing the organisation. And just a quick reminder, as we discussed in Unit 1, that when we talk about marketing environments, we're talking about the 6 key markets of the customer markets, the employee markets, the referrer markets, the influencer markets, the supplier markets, and the internal markets within the organisation. A very common tool that's used to understand industries is Michael Porter's model, referred to as the 5 forces model. And we seek to understand an industry by looking at the interaction of 5 forces. The first of which is the intensity with which the competitors in the industry fight for market dominance or market participation. So how intensely do they compete, and on what basis do they compete, and what is the relative strengths and weaknesses of each of the competitors in the industry. Affecting that, though, is the potential for other organisations to enter or exit an industry. So if it's easy to get into an industry or easy to exit or easy to exit an industry, then we not only need to consider the existing competitors, but who else might join. Now, in some industries, you can start a business overnight. Software and IT, for example, lots of businesses spring up overnight. And that affects that industry differently to, say, if you were trying to be a steel maker, where it would take years, or an airline where it would take years to get the necessary licenses and build the infrastructure. So in the software industry, the threat of new entrants is relatively high. In the steel industry, it's relatively low because it would take a very long period of time and there are significant barriers to entry. So the strength of those forces, that's just an illustration that the strength of those forces differs between industries, and that was just meant to illustrate that. Equally, the third force we need to understand is what's the potential for substitution. So if I think about an industry like the taxi industry, then an example, Uber, was a threat of a substitute. Not only were the taxis competing with other taxis, but they were also competing with ride sharing, the Uber type service. They compete with public transport. They compete with people driving their own cars and parking. They also compete in many cases with people being able to walk or ride a bicycle or something. So it's not only a question of taxis competing with other taxis, but with other forms of being able to get from point A to point B. And therefore we need to be careful that we don't narrow our focus and just think about we only compete with other people who are called the same thing as we are. But we also compete with other ways that the customer may actually get their needs met, even though it's a different type of business to the one that we are operating and competing with. The fourth force that we talk about that we need to understand in an industry is the relative power of suppliers because in some industries there are critical components, there are powerful suppliers, and those critical components or the strategies of those powerful suppliers may well have an impact on how competition occurs and who is the most successful. A very simple example that I often use is Intel. Because Intel produces the chip that just about everybody's PCs run on, then if I'm a PC maker, then what Intel produces and the types of chips they produce and the availability of those chips will influence my ability to compete. Equally, in many devices, the quality of the screen is a highly important component in the device itself, and therefore if you've got a few powerful high caliber screen makers, then their ability to supply and their innovation and their creativity will determine the ability I have as a device maker to offer a superior value proposition based on the imagery on the screen. And finally, in some industries, an easy example to pick on is in defence, where there are a few buyers, and they are very large and powerful buyers, the US Department of Defence probably being the world's biggest buyer of everything defence-oriented. And in health systems, quite often, the public health provider is a big and powerful purchaser of equipment and drugs, etc., etc. So if you have a few powerful customers, they can also shape the way in which competition occurs and the structure of the value propositions that exist in the industry. And therefore, in summary, those five forces, the interaction of those five forces and understanding the interaction of those five forces and how powerful each is and how they influence the value propositions and the behaviour of customers and competitors within the industry becomes a critical output and generates critical insights from which marketing strategy is then developed. Sitting around the industry, as you know, I mentioned already, is the external environment, the macro environment, and that often contains a number of uncontrollable forces that can mould and reshape the business environment. And we use a technique called PESTLE analysis, which is an acronym using the first letter of each of the forces that are listed down here on the slide. So we need to understand what are the political forces and how are they operating at the moment, what's going on in the political environment in terms of regulation, in terms of the difference between parties in their intentions about how they would govern, or in those places that don't have democratically elected governments, the factions within the ruling party or group, what are they doing about the way industry will work and about the things they will favour, and how are they going to control things, and what are they looking for from participants in an industry. So political forces have a major effect. Obviously economic forces such as currency exchange rates and interest rates and the ability to borrow and consumer confidence and a whole range of economic forces have a major impact on the way an industry and industries will operate. The structure of the society, the norms, the components, the ages, the points at which people have children, get married, buy homes, all of those things, and the changes in ethnic makeup and attitudes to particular types of consumption and purchasing, and attitudes to raising families and education, and all of those forces that make up a society and a community, and how those forces are changing is a critical issue for us to understand, because from those things will come opportunities or threats to an existing business model or to a new business model and a new value proposition. Technology, it would be fairly obvious to anyone who opens the paper or turns on the television that the constant change in technology, the constant number of new technologies being released, and the use of technology as a driving force in creating new value propositions and differentiating value propositions is another force that we need to understand, and how that not only impacts existing business models and value propositions, but potential business models and value propositions. So we need to understand technology, and I use that term more broadly than just digital technology. So in industries like agriculture, digital technology plays a part, but genetic modification of crops and pesticides and issues like that are far more significant. And therefore, we need to understand the broadness of technology and how it influences an industry. Legal forces, the willingness of people to take legal action, the decisions that are taken by courts, the agitation by legal advocates to try and stimulate cases from which they can generate revenue. Those sorts of issues will change the way an industry works and change the behaviour of participants in an industry. And of course, the impact on the environment, the broader environment or the ecology, things like climate change and the increasing number and frequency of unanticipated climatic events, droughts, floods, earthquakes, etc., will change entire industries and impact on not only the industry and the infrastructure, but the consumers' attitudes, etc. So all of those forces quickly go up to make what we refer to as the macro environment, and we use the term PESTEL for political, economic, sociocultural, technological, legal and ecological forces. And these are the things that we try and understand as sources of either opportunities and threats to all participants in the industry. And then we typically use Porter's 5 forces to try and understand the unique nature of the industry itself.